Welcome to this video where I'll be discussing how you can demonstrate a research gap and contribution within your research. The concepts of a research gap and contribution are really important because through identifying a research gap, you can demonstrate that your research is novel, and through demonstrating a contribution, you can highlight the value of your research. And these are important concepts in order to show that your work is of a doctoral standard. So first of all, what is a research gap? Well, at its most simplest, it's something which has not already been researched. Therefore, there's a gap in the research because it hasn't been done. And this means there's a gap in our knowledge and understanding of something. And in order for a piece of research to be novel, we need to identify a research gap. And this is important in order to ensure that our research is original and we're finding something new. However, going beyond just offering something new, if we can robustly identify a research gap, and if we can identify from the literature the value and benefits of researching something which has not previously been researched, we can also identify how our research is making a contribution, and particularly a theoretical contribution to the literature. So a word of warning. Whilst it is important to identify a research gap to ensure and demonstrate that your research is novel, simply stating there is a gap because something has not been researched before does not ensure that you're offering a contribution to the literature and theory. This is because simply because something has not been researched before doesn't mean there's value in researching it. And therefore it's important to be able to support the research gap and explain its value. It is for this reason that I personally recommend trying to refrain from using language such as, to the best of the author's knowledge, something has not been researched before. Whilst this might be true, just researching something that hasn't been researched before might be a gap, but it doesn't mean that you're contributing anything of value because there's so many things which have not been researched. Just researching something without scaffolding around it and explaining why it's valuable and important can lead to questions around the contribution. However, if you can robustly identify a research gap using supporting literature and scaffolding the area you're researching by explaining the need and value for what you're researching and how you're building on previous research, this offers an opportunity to explain how your research contributes to the academic literature. So I think it's important not to get overly focused on just trying to explain a particular gap, as in this is something that's never been done before, but it's really valuable in order to highlight a contribution, the value of your research and how it's building on other research. So when it comes to finding and identifying a research gap, there are common places you can look to in order to locate research gaps. So for example, the context of research. If you're looking at the previous research and it's all been done in a particular geographical region or industry, it might be possible to say, okay, well, we know that this theory works in the US or it works in Europe, but we don't know it works in Asia or we don't know it works in a particular country. Similarly, it's possible to identify gaps in research based on the industry it's been researched. So it might be all the previous research has been done in a particular industry, for example finance or manufacturing, or even a particular size of business. So there's much research saying that family businesses work and operate differently. So if the previous literature has only looked at public limited companies, it might be that private family-owned businesses are different, and therefore the context where we're collecting our data and researching might lead to different results, and there might be a gap in our understanding of how a particular phenomenon applies within an industry, region or type of business. It's also possible to identify potential research gaps based on methodologies previously used. So as we know, some methodologies are very focused on depth. So for example, case studies or narrative research. They really want to understand a phenomenon and understand and interpret what's going on. But these types of research designs recognise that their strength is depth and not generalisation. Our more statistical approaches to research commonly seek generalisation, and they seek to generalise based on statistics. Therefore, there can be times where, based on the previous research, there's a gap in our knowledge. Similarly, it might be that there are new angles available. So this could come from bringing in a particular angle or lens based on an existing topic. So for example, how artificial intelligence could influence communication. And actually by bringing in a new angle to a traditional view or a traditionally researched area can actually provide gaps in our knowledge on how we can apply a particular technology, angle or lens to something that's been well researched before. And finally, there are cases in the research where mixed results exist, where there's not a consensus on particular factors that influence something else, if you're seeking generalisation, or there's not consensus based on where the boundaries are when we're looking at in-depth research. And where these kind of mixed results and lack of clarity exist, we can argue that there's actually a research gap there, and therefore we need further research to be able to move forward our understanding and knowledge in a given area. When it comes to presenting research gaps, it's important to ensure that they're not presented in isolation from the literature. Previous literature should be used and explained and unpacked to identify what we do know and what we don't know, and what the boundaries of our existing knowledge is. And when we do this, we can explain how we're potentially incrementally furthering our knowledge. And particularly when it comes to doctoral studies and most business research, we're not producing groundbreaking science, but rather what we're trying to do is incrementally further our knowledge. And to explain how we're doing this, it's useful to explain how we're building on existing knowledge. And one of the most useful ways of explaining how we're furthering existing knowledge is by linking what we're doing to the boundaries of our existing knowledge. And I think it can be useful to think not of a knowledge gap, but what are the deficiencies of our knowledge? Because often a gap sounds like a big hole, and these deficiencies can be linked to the context, the methodological processes previously used, unexplored angles, and mixed results. So it can be useful to explain the boundaries of our knowledge in terms of what we know, but the boundaries where we don't know something, and then highlight these deficiencies in our knowledge. And this helps us give a more well-rounded research gap, rather than simply saying we don't know something. So when it comes to making a contribution, we need to explain why what we're doing and what we're researching is providing knowledge which is valuable. for a DBA and a Doctor of Business Administration degree, we have to not only make a theoretical contribution, but also a practical contribution. And for practitioners doing doctoral level research, it's often the practical contribution which comes easiest. And therefore, I think identifying the boundaries and deficiencies of knowledge and then explaining how we're extending and furthering this knowledge is one of the best ways to actually identify how you're making an academic and theoretical contribution and discovering something not only that hasn't been looked at and explored before, but is of value to the readership, the scholars and the literature in this area. And one of the best ways of doing this is to identify what recent journal articles in your area have called for, because if you can demonstrate that previous research is calling for this to advance our knowledge, not only can you use this citation, this source to support what you're doing is adding new knowledge in a gap, you can demonstrate that it's a value, that a particular author or set of authors are saying we don't know this because this is where our knowledge ends, and there's value in knowing this. So a few recommendations from my own personal experience. I think it's really useful to start noting and jotting down calls for future research in quality papers as you go along, and ensure that the papers that you're looking at are contemporary. And it might be useful to have a separate Word document or Excel sheet or whatever works for you, where you can jot down and keep a note of these calls for future research. Also, when reviewing and writing about the existing literature, make sure you critically analyse the weaknesses and boundaries of previous literature. It can be very tempting just to talk about the positives of previous literature, explaining how they help inform the field. But it's only by being critical we can highlight the boundaries of the existing literature in our field. And through highlighting these boundaries, we can highlight a gap. Also, don't wait for the perfect research gap or call for future research. You have to keep writing and you have to keep reading. I would always recommend it's useful to identify a research gap and call for future research before you start collecting your data. However, it's useful to get involved in the literature early. And this is why I say, as you go through, keep noting these calls for future research. But don't wait for a call for future research until you get started really reviewing the literature. It's also useful to piece together calls for future research. Don't just rely on one particular call. And ultimately, you need to craft together a narrative around the deficiencies in the existing literature and craft together a narrative around the calls for research to explain what's required and how you're going to address this with your research. Hopefully these recommendations and tips help move you forward with identifying and explaining a potential research gap, plus provide some guidance as to how identifying a gap using supporting literature and calls for further research can help support justifying how your research moves the literature forward and makes a theoretical contribution.